taped and broadcast on the GSE YouTube channel. So, you know, you should just know that, and any questions that you ask will be captured on the video. So ask politely and be brilliant. It's my pleasure to introduce Beth Rubin along with Deirdre Doherty, who are from ETPA. And Beth has done an awful lot of work around civic identity and students from different contexts and cultures. And the work today is around the work that she's been doing in Guatemala. And so we're really thrilled to have her. So,
thank you. Thank you. Is this? You guys can hear me without it, right? Yes. So I am really thrilled to see all of you here. I'm amazed. I thought it would be Carol and I, maybe me. So this is very exciting for me. This is the first time I've presented about this work at the GSE, and it's the first time I've talked about one aspect of the methodology of the study in this kind of a formal setting at all. So I'm very interested to hear what people have to say, see if people find it useful, hear what kinds of feedback people have. So this presentation is really going to focus on one of the ways that I, with the assistance of Dee, who came and helped me with this study 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, one of the ways that I collected data, which was using images on cards, and we'll pass some of those around a little bit later, to facilitate conversation in focus groups. But before we get to that, I'm going to talk about the study in general, because I think that the context helps you understand what we were doing, why I chose to use those cards, and helps us, when we look at some data, to collectively try a little bit interpreting. So this is a research project that I started in January 2013, when I spent 6 months in Guatemala investigating youth civic identity in a variety of Guatemalan schools. And just a little bit about the context of Guatemala. Can't do justice to the history of a country in 20 seconds, but just a little bit of background. The history of Guatemala stretches back thousands of years to a pre-colonial Mayan civilization marked by artistic, astronomical, and engineering accomplishments, a brutal Spanish conquest and colonial period in which the area's indigenous inhabitants were basically enslaved to work on their own appropriated lands, followed by independence from Spain, which largely benefited a wealthy Creole class, liberal reform, U.S. intervention, military dictatorship, and a 36-year-long armed struggle between populist guerrilla groups and the country's military regimes, broadly recognized as a vastly uneven struggle in terms of the power and consequences for those two groups. So in 1996, that civil conflict came to an end with the signing of what's called the Firm and Lasting Peace Accords. And these were UN-brokered accords, and they included a promise by the government to design and implement a national civic education program for democracy and peace, promoting the protection of human rights, the renewal of political culture, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. So really central in these peace accords was the idea that education would be part of civic transformation, and that following a really violent 30 years in which over 200,000 people were killed, I think they say about 95% of them from indigenous communities, that education would be at the forefront of transforming society into a peaceful, democratic society. So how are they going to do this? Well, education reform, right? So they began to develop a new national curriculum. And the new national curriculum included frameworks around democratic practice, and around multiculturalism, and around learning about human rights. And most of the edicts, the peace accords, which found their way into the curriculum, were instantiated in the social sciences and civic development classes. So that those classes were really the place where the rubber was supposed to meet the road in terms of working with kids to transform society civically. I've got a bunch of little images here. As you might guess, transforming national identity through education is not that simple. And young Guatemalans' locally constructed notions of citizenship and belonging, developed amid the disparately felt legacies of conquest, colonization, exploitation, and repression, competed with the national civic education policy that put trust in the healing powers of recognition, multiculturalism, and democracy. And elsewhere I've written about looking at these the civic education reforms as part of a global policy scape of education reform focusing on democracy and multiculturalism. So it's not just in Guatemala that that local actors are reacting to a global push for multiculturalism and democracy. It's in a lot of post-conflict settings, but I'm particularly interested in how it played out in this particular setting. So we just have a few images from really different classrooms. Here's a fake ballot that was used in a political education seminar in a private school. Here's a vision statement in a public school. Women and men conserve natural resources, using bicycles, other things like that. Here's a poster that's commemorating the 30th anniversary of a massacre during the armed conflict. Here's a textbook in indigenous language, and instruction in indigenous languages is another part of the education reform from the peace accords. Girls doing a presentation about indigenous dress in a public school classroom. So lots of varied and disparate ways that these edicts for multiculturalism, democracy, human rights took shape in Guatemalan classrooms. So let's get even a little bit closer with examples of how kids are thinking about things differently, depending on what context they're in. So for example, while I was there, this guy was on trial. This is Efrain Rios Montt. He was president during the bloodiest years of the Guatemalan armed conflict. And he was on trial for genocide, and it actually got a lot of press. You might have heard about it because he was the first leader to be put on trial for genocide by his own country, not by international courts. And there was a lot of international press, there were protests, it was very public trial. He was charged with crimes against humanity, he was convicted, sentenced to 80 years in prison, and then really quickly the conviction was overturned through there were a lot of complaints about procedure that was based on, and there's a new trial. He's in house arrest currently, and there's a new trial scheduled for January 2015. So this is a very kind of current issue. So I'm going to just talk about 3 different schools that we visited and how people, educators and kids in those sites talked about that particular thing that was going on. So these are all pseudonyms. So El Básico is a public middle school, right? Yeah, public middle school in an indigenous village, not too far from a fairly major city, and this is a snippet of field notes where the teacher's talking to his kids in his social science class about the armed conflict. So Profe, which is what they affectionately call male teachers, Profe says, the theme is genocide. What would genocide be? To kill, exploit, but a human culture. For example, we've heard tell of a German, of the Nazis, of the famous, Jose says, Hitler. Profe answers, Adolf Hitler, the one that committed genocide against the Jews. Now here in Guatemala, it is said that Rios Montt committed genocide against, says, the indigenous. Profe confirms. Our indigenous culture, our Mayan culture. But many say that it wasn't genocide. But there are 3 important things that we know to declare genocide. But we all don't know this because they don't explain it. They don't tell it. We are here, we come to form ourselves bit by bit, and this is what this course is about. So meanwhile, at El Colegio, one of the other schools that, that we visited, which you can probably tell is a more affluent setting, private school, kindergarten through high school, small classes, bilingual curriculum, and in a focus group. We did our focus groups in El Colegio, well, in El Básico we did our focus groups on very, you want to describe it, Dee?
Yeah, in a stairwell.
Yeah, basically in a stairwell with these really rickety desks and kids clustered around and kids coming through and lots of noise, right? In El Colegio, they had a quite nice outdoor eating area with spotless picnic tables, and there were flowers all around, you know, so we were sitting at these tables and the breeze is coming through and the flowers smell beautiful. And we were working with them with the images, and Ricardo says, after choosing a picture of the Rios Montt card, really, there wasn't genocide in Guatemala. Ana says, there wasn't genocide, but I feel they're only judging one side. They aren't doing anything to the guerrillas, despite that they were guerrillas, and they also killed people. And Eva says, we're all more or less in agreement, because when he did it, he was general of Guatemala and was ensuring the good of everyone, intending to stop the internal war. And so a really different perspective on the armed conflict and the current trial, and in terms of coming in and trying to understand civic identity development, obviously context is really important, and in terms of the country trying to move forward and develop new forms of civic identity, these are also really important themes. And then a third site, El Instituto, which is a secondary school, public secondary school, normal school, all girls, and these girls are learning to be teachers, and mixed indigenous and Ladino school. We talked to the girls in focus groups about the same topic, and Beta says, yes, and supposedly it wasn't genocide, but who knows in the end. In my personal opinion, I do believe that it was genocide. I believe that it was genocide. And Irma says, yes, it was genocide. And Tina says, we didn't live it, but maybe our families. Alma, my parents, at least my mother lived it. It was exactly on her birthday. This is how she marked it, and she tells it. And Irma, I had an uncle that was put into the army because he went outside. They had told them to stay inside at 6 already. Nobody could leave their homes. And at 6:15, he was in the park, and the army grabbed him and took him. He was there for 3 months, and he was in skirmishes between the guerrilla and the army. He says that he went to Quiche in the forest, but it seemed like fireworks, the bullets. Okay. So, again, we're going to dig into some data later, so we can talk about all the things that are in these discussions. Students are positioning themselves. We learn about what groups they feel like they're a part of, what groups they feel like they're not a part of. We'll dive into that later, but this is just to kind of set the context for the study. So then this research then considered the complex ways that attempts to reshape post-conflict Guatemalan national identity through policy-driven curricular reform were taken up, engaged with, contested, and transformed at the local level. And it used what Bartlett calls ethnographic vertical case studies of civic learning across different educational settings to probe the ways that educational policy after the peace accords was appropriated locally. And we did analysis of curriculum and policy as well, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And as you can see already, probably, the understandings of national history, ethnic identity, peace, and violence expressed by students across a range of settings reveals the way that identity, privilege, oppression, both historical and contemporary, shape Guatemalan youth's disparate production of civic identity amid what's an ostensibly standardized curriculum. So how do you capture, or how do you develop an understanding of civic identity amid all of those contextual issues and differences? I set out to collect data in a variety of sites. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 6, the 6 sites that we focused on, and the first 4 are really the ones that became the focal sites. So a mix of public and private, and a mix of indigenous and Ladino. And Ladino is the term used to refer to Guatemalans of European heritage, or mixed. They don't use the term mestizo, which is popular in Mexico. That's a whole other political discussion. Or like you can see the array here of sites. So the red, whether it was an institute or a colegio, so the institutos being public, colegios being private, urban or rural, and low, middle, or high income. So, best I could, I tried to get a range. And then collecting data. So actually, I usually started with observations. So observations of civic events and activities, the general school setting, in order to try to understand varied spaces for civic learning. So this always included social studies classrooms, sometimes included indigenous language classrooms, sometimes included a class called seminario, which was like a action research kind of class. Yeah. And then public events at the school site. And then focus groups with small groups of young people using civic images. We did 17 total with 71 kids. And then interviews with teachers, students, and then also Ministry of Educational officials, school directors. And the youth interviews followed the focus groups and document analysis. Okay, so where did I get this crazy idea? Well, I had read a couple of my colleagues in social studies education research have used images in their data collection, and I remembered this from my reading because I started to think about, even before I went, how am I going to talk about abstractions like citizenship and identity with kids? I mean, I know from my own work and from working with students on similar questions that you really can't go at it head on, right? You don't sit down with a person and say, so, how does it feel to be Guatemalan? What's that like? What's your civic identity? Because people don't, none of us were thinking those ways. There's nothing limiting these particular people. That's really not how we think about those kinds of more abstract aspects of our identity, which in practice are not actually abstract, but when we talk about it, we turn them into abstractions. So, so Terry Epstein in 2000 did a study where she was thinking about and interested in how kids from different racial groups interpreted U.S. history. And so she had kids, well, she describes it here. She says, to elicit students' perspectives on racial diversity, my graduate students and I used an original task and analysis. We asked each student working individually to select from a set of 51 captioned pictures, the 20 most significant actors and events in U.S. history, and explain their choices. Students constructed themes that frame their selections and explanations. The interviewer asked the students to explain or reconcile the great paradox of U.S. history, which pitted the principle of individual rights and democratic rule against ongoing practices of racial oppression. So kids did like a ranking and sorting activity. They selected these 20 images, and then they explained why. They did not do this collectively. They did it individually, and they debriefed individually with the researcher. And in reporting her results, she reported a lot of even the numbers, and she did analysis. Boys tended to pick this, girls tended to pick this, younger students pick these, older students pick these. So she was using them in quantitative ways as well. And then Barton and Levstick, they gave kids 20 images and a 500-year-long timeline, and asked them to pick the eight most important events to place on that timeline. And the kids did do this in groups, but they did not record the group process. They didn't collect the conversations that the kids happened. They looked at the rankings. They again, actually also for both of these, they were very interested in race. So they said, well, African American kids pick these, white kids tend to pick these. That kind of an analysis. The Barton and Levstick as well. And as I said, the kids were talking to each other, but they didn't use that data. So what I did, or in my civic identity research in the U.S., I had used a elicitation technique, which I didn't call an elicitation technique, but it was just something I thought to do, in classrooms in which I had students participate in a discussion about the Pledge of Allegiance. So kids in different classrooms, really different communities, read the Pledge of Allegiance and discussed it. And that discussion became my data. So kind of thinking about that and thinking about these images, I started thinking about, well, how, I really would like to get kids talking about these issues, and maybe images are a way to do it. And then just recently, I found this guy, Harper, a sociologist, who also writes about using images, and he talks about how images connect core definitions of the self to society, culture, and history, corresponding to postmodern sociology's decentered narrative, the sociology of the body, social studies of emotion. And this is even a little closer to what I was getting at, which is how do you tap into these things that are really kind of close and personal and emotional for people, so that they can speak from what they're feeling and not from what they think they should be saying, or some kind of theoretical interpretation of their own situations. So I was particularly interested in the sense that young people made together of the major issues impacting them. So instead of integrating the images into individual interviews, I decided that I wanted to use the images in focus groups, to have them have something to talk about when we were in these focus groups, and to kind of ground concretely the abstractions that we were talking about. And Dee and I were just talking downstairs about some of the other things that came out of using images, and we'll kind of hit upon those as we go. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process. Selecting the images, I wasn't able to do until I got there and had spent some time there, because I was just too far from it. And I selected a set of images, and as we go through them, I'll explain a little bit how. But after I selected that set, I piloted it. I ran it by teaching a graduate qualitative research course, so I ran it by a couple of my students who were themselves faculty at a university there, and got their feedback, and we kind of altered it as we went on. We kind of edited the images so that they were closer to the meaning that the students were making out of them. And yeah, selecting, vetting, piloting, refining. So loosely, kind of 5 themes in the images. So one was Mayan culture. So thinking about how young people might see the connection between the ancient Mayan people and themselves, or between ancient Mayan people and contemporary indigenous descendants who make up between 40 and 60% of the population in Guatemala. How do they see themselves in relation to ancient Mayan people and to contemporary indigenous Guatemalans? So thinking about those questions, with pictures of Mayan glyphs, Tikal, which is a Mayan pyramid, a Mayan archaeological site in the north of the country. Contemporary woman doing backstrap weaving. Rigoberta Menchú receiving the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. And here's some traditional dance in a small community. Economy. So how are young people thinking about economic disparities, the consequences, the causes? Do they express affiliation or disaffiliation with particular images? And you can see there's going to be overlap too. So cooking with firewood, which is done by, the statistic was like 70% of the country cooks with firewood. And then other people never cook with firewood. This is the municipal garbage dump in Guatemala City. This this is a graffiti against CAFTA, against the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which I thought, oh, this international economic issues, and none of the kids had any idea what this was.
So these weren't labeled? So the,
They were labeled.
tiles that you're giving us, did they come with the image?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, titles came with the image. Yeah, but I'll talk more about the graffiti later, but the graffiti had an unintended interpretation, unintended by me. This is a school made out of garbage, made out of bottles like this filled with garbage. There are a lot of philanthropic projects going on in Guatemala by Americans and other Westerners. And one thing that happens a lot is people make schools for kids out of bottles of garbage in them. This is a kind of luxury development shopping plaza in Guatemala City. This is the very vague category of popular culture. So this is marimba is the national instrument. Some of you may be familiar with pollo campero, which is the national fried chicken. It's very delicious. This is the soccer team, football team. This is Antigua in particular. The city that we were living in is famous for these big celebrations preceding Easter, where they create these incredible carpets out of natural materials, mostly flowers and all kinds of things, and it's really incredible. And it covers the entire city, all the streets. So it's called Semana Santa. So, and coffee. And then images related to politics. How are people describing the government and its institution, trust, distrust, what experiences have they had with these institutions. So these are, this is what happens before an election. And if anybody's traveled in Latin America, you know, it's pretty consistent, right? There's lots of posters everywhere and things painted. And what's that? Okay.
And then horns, right? They're
Oh, yes, and cars, yeah, driving around blaring announcements, right? The old Guatemalan flag. This was another piece of graffiti that I was thinking, oh, this is great. You know, this is graffiti. We're searching for Mejia Victores and Rios Montt for genocide. I'll explain later how the kids interpreted it. But. And then historical events or figures. So this is Pedro Alvarado, who was the conquistador of Guatemala. This is the historic peace accords signing. This is the elite Guatemalan army force, the Caibiles, who were very active during the armed conflict. This is an image that I forgot to move back to the politics side. It's the Constitution. This is Tekun Uman, who's kind of mythic Mayan figure, kind of the last Mayan prince who resisted the Spanish. And there's a holiday for him. Okay, so those are not the final set of images that we ended up using, but most of them are there, and we'll talk about the tweaks in a minute. In terms of the protocol we used, sat down with 4 to 6 kids at a table, and this was kind of the opener. Hello, thank you for participating. I have 28 images of Guatemala. I'm going to ask questions about the images. You're going to talk to each other and work together to answer. And then the way it would go is we would ask something, and the kids would make their selections. We'd record the selections, and then we'd start asking them why they chose what they chose. And then wherever the conversation went, we would follow it. So, so these are the questions that we used. Choose all the images that relate to something you've studied in school. So that was more of an inventory to see what the kids are studying in school. Choose 3 images that represent something you experience a lot that's part of your day-to-day life. 3 images that represent the biggest problems facing the country today. 3 images that make you proud to be Guatemalan or to live in Guatemala. 3 to 5 images that represent the most important events in the history of Guatemala. 3 images of things all Guatemalans have in common. 3 images of things that divide Guatemalans from each other. And then choose the thing you have the most confidence in and the thing you have the least confidence in. then finally, what would you have liked to have been included that wasn't? So as we went through this, there were some things that the kids said were missing. Do you want
About the family?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, because that was interesting.
Yeah. So we sort of struggled because on the one hand, we wanted to have an image that would elicit a certain sort of response loosely tied to an abstract concept. But on the other, we were really aware of, well, what is going to be a generalizable image that will allow for subjective interpretations, but then also have like a response that will tie to something meaningful in terms of the research questions. So we struggled with the idea of family. Students brought that up as something that was super important to them and important to their sense of being Guatemalan. We struggled with an image that would be generalizable, that would allow the disparate groups that we were working with to pick and choose and kind of point to as important. So we did a Google image search, which about family, which was problematic because we wanted it to have the affective ties, so have it be extended and speak to the kind of the way that people saw their family as not just a nuclear family, but we also wanted it to be not overly indigenous and not overly Latino, so there was something that both groups of people would be able to kind of like attach themselves to. So
yeah, because kids would, at the very beginning would say, "What's missing?" They say, "Family." They wanted an image of family. So yes, selecting this image of family was kind of an interesting process. We ended up with this family, this poor family, La Familia Ortiz, who has no idea that they're in my card of civic images, but since it was online, I guess it's fair game. And it seemed to work because kids from across all the different schools would select this to represent family. And then Jesus was something that or religion, Jesus, the church, was something they mentioned as missing. So we ended up with that image, which was a popular selection. There were some images that needed to be changed for clarity. So I didn't have an image of police, but the kids wanted to talk about the police a lot. What they didn't trust, right? What they saw every day. There were a lot of conversations in which they wanted to talk about police. And so they would use this part of the Caibiles to talk about the police. And I knew that it wasn't the police, so I just decided to swap out for an actual part of police because the Caibiles were, I think, just too remote and too particular and, for the kids to really latch onto. Kids talked a lot about gangs and delinquency. So we added this image. And then because we added that image, we figured we better add that image, which I think was a good move because that image was, selected and selected school or technology, right. So, and then there were some images that were redundant. So I had Mayan glyphs, anti-call, and whether they picked one or the other wasn't particularly meaningful at all. Or like the guy on top, I don't know if you guys know who that is, Ferrando. He was the first Guatemalan to win a Olympic medal. He won the silver for speed walking. And so people were really proud of him, but they kind of used it interchangeably with the soccer stuff. So we ended up taking out one or the other. And I think I added in an image of like some of the natural beauty of the country. And then unexpected interpretations. So these are images that were in different groupings. So the garbage dump, I thought they might talk about poverty and inequality. The graffiti, I thought they would talk about political protest. And the campaign posters, I thought they talked about electoral politics. But all of these images they used to talk about contamination and environmental degradation. Which they wanted to talk about a lot, way more than I didn't even think about it, that they would want to talk about that. And that was across all the settings, that they picked out these images to talk about contamination and how terrible it was and how they needed to do things to save the earth. So we just left those, I don't know if I left the graffiti, but left the other ones, and if they wanted to use it to talk about contamination, then they did. So thinking, then using these images for analysis. So one thing that we could do right away was do a tally. How frequently were they used. And there's some things to be learned by this. So here's an example of a tally from El Instituto, which is the girls' public school. Couple of interesting things. They have the least confidence in police, which was consistent pretty much across all the schools. Police were the thing that people have the least confidence in. So if you're thinking about civic identity and people's civic identity, that's significant. Most confidence in religion and family, which was also similar to their peers at the wealthier school that we're going to talk about at Colegio. On the other hand, their daily life selections, so things that they saw every day, cooking with firewood, weaving, Jesus, those were in many ways different from El Colegio's choices of things they saw every day, which included the high-end shopping center and Pollo Campero, but also included gangs and police. But the tallies don't really show the richness of the data, and so I wanted us to look at some data. I'll do that. And talk about, and we can talk about what we might see or be able to interpret from here. We're good like that. Oh, wait. So just to get us started, so some of the questions I thought of, I mean, these are kind of questions that we're looking at this for data analysis are, so with whom are the students affiliating with, or what groups do they see themselves as belonging to in these conversations? How do they understand or describe each other or other people, other groups? How do they interpret past history in relation to themselves? How are they describing, interpreting, accounting for inequality in the country? So maybe we'll read one and then let you guys kind of talk about it with each other, and then we can do the other, then we can come back together and see the differences. So El Colegio. Want to read it just alternate? Sure. So this is when El Colegio picked out a picture of Rigoberta Menchú. I think it's something they studied in school, and they're laughing at it.
I don't see why they gave her the Nobel Prize, said one.
I see it like, I don't know, I see it as an apology toward the culture for having treated people. She didn't really do anything.
Well, she won the Nobel Prize for defending the indigenous people from discrimination for them.
It's that the discrimination goes on both sides. The indigenous discriminate towards the Latinos, and the Latinos towards the indigenous, but she's a spokesperson for the indigenous.
What doesn't seem right to me is that Rigoberta Menchú was part of the guerrillas, and she has immunity because she's a Nobel Prize winner.
If they're going to try him, they should try both. Because when they signed the peace accords, they said that it was erased, and a new story wouldn't be touched, so that Guatemala could continue improving.
It supposedly ended the guerrillas. There was an erasure and a new beginning, supposedly.
So you don't believe it?
It's because it is the same. This is linked to Rios Montt. This is linked with the same thing we've been talking about. But here in Guatemala, we continue not to forget or not to notice the change. That is, the guerrilla is finished, but the people keep saying that we must find the guilty and all of that.
Okay, so maybe take a few minutes to talk with the people around you about either the questions or anything else that strikes you in these conversations.
She was there last night.
No, they're trying to spice it.
look at the other data on the other side. So just quick observations, comments, insights that people had reading this and talking about it. Yes, Cheryl.
We had a lot of things, but the one thing I thought was interesting was that they still feel like they're being blamed as Latinos. So regardless of what happened then, whatever happened then still makes them feel like they're the ones that are being blamed for that.
Interesting, right. And so you can imagine, like, I can't imagine an interview question, right, that would get at that particularly, directly. Okay, great. Other ideas?
I had a thought too, when we were talking about it. In your very first example from El Básico, I think, the teacher was talking to the students. And here these are students talking to each other, and I wondered what they heard from their teachers, because teachers might often be not the same social class as the students at a private school. And so, is this what they're hearing at home from parents? Is this how they're talking to each other? And then we talked about too, how new you just said, how do you get them to elicit things that are influenced by your presence too? I don't know if you looked into that at all. I mean, you have data from
we have classroom data, and
what were their teachers saying?
Well, this school, El Colegio, had a kind of, I mean, they're in a lot of ways mirroring some of what they're saying. They had a kind of two sides interpretation. There's the guerrillas and there's the army, and they were both fighting, and it was really bad, and now it's gone.
Did you talk to the teachers alone too? Because I would think like the parents might want them to be teaching that to these students.
Well, and that's sort of the national interpretation, and that's the textbook interpretation, and that's now the teacher in El Básico was much more
very political
in his approach, in his indigenous community, where he was really connecting it to the kids' background. And then the kids talked about, and I don't think I have it in this presentation, but the kids talked about how their parents, these kids, El Colegio, how their parents felt like it was better then, more violent now. So these are definitely things that they're hearing at home, for sure. Any other things that you folks notice about how they're positioning themselves or seeing history? Yeah.
It kind of felt like they were insinuating that the other group is just not willing to let it go, right? The indigenous group, yes, there's discrimination on both sides, they're killing on both sides, and we're willing to move on, and this other group is not letting it go.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I was drawing parallels to this country and thinking about segregation and slavery and saying, well, that's of the past and let's move on. And actually it's sort of a very colorblind kind of take on it, as well as sort of not considering who was in power and how power sort of changes these dynamics, whereas they're saying, well, we're discriminated against. Well, in what ways? How does this play out? How does power sort of important?
Yeah, there's definitely, we talked about this, but an awareness of structural issues between the two schools is quite different. So it's been much more individualized in El Colegio and not El Instituto, but compared to El Básico, where there's a real critical consciousness fomenting, and that the teacher is very aware of positioning his children within these structural and not just individual issues.
Yeah.
And that would be a moment where the teacher positionality really affects the ostensibly standardized curriculum.
Right.
It's kind of cool.
Right. I mean, they're all supposedly doing the CNAA, but it takes a very different shape. So let's just take a peek at the other side then. And I chose this also because they're talking about the same issue, the same image of Rika Bertimenchu, and they chose it for Pride. She won the Nobel Peace Prize and Pride.
She's one of the great representatives of Guatemala, the fighters of Guatemala.
She was the Nobel Peace Prize.
We learned that she suffered because of the armed conflict.
That in spite of being a woman, she overcame.
She's a great example for women. And in spite of being indigenous, like the teacher said, she had three things that she was discriminated against for. She was indigenous, and she was a woman, and don't remember well the other.
Then they chose Otto Perez Molina as a divisive force. Many people say he's in favor of the upper class, upper or middle, because he always appears at things or events with people that have a lot of money.
there are some parties that go to the left and others that go to the right. So we went with the parties at the right that are of the rich people. But since the beginning, one knew that he went with the rich people, and because of this, he had the help of the Guatemalan rich, and they supported him economically for the campaigns that he made and for all of that.
Otto Perez Molina won in Guatemala because in all of the departments he didn't win because of the indigenous people, and the indigenous people didn't want him. I believe that they knew his history. So Perez Molina is the current president, and he had also been active during the armed conflict. That's basically everybody had been. Not unusual. So I don't know. We can do this collectively. Anything that people want to observe about that, or comparisons?
I think it's funny how this group is saying, she suffered and overcame, and sort of she was a fighter, whereas the other group's like, well, she didn't do anything. It's just a representative. So really sort of belittling. I mean, I don't know much about her, but it's the way they're discussing her in the two schools is very, very different.
Obviously, the fact that the institute is a girls' school, right? There's a lot of women pride.
And it's mixed ethnicity too. Yes. So there was a theme which I wasn't really looking for at all, but a theme of gender and feminism in that school, which was pretty interesting too.
Did the other schools that were not girls' schools also did either girls or boys comment on her as an inspiration to girls?
No. Right? I don't think so.
I don't think so, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a gender.
You see that they're taking kind of a really critical spin, thinking that there's the president of Guatemala, but then they chose that president as the divisive force of the nation. That kind of speaks to them kind of not passively just receiving the president as the appeal to this president, but more about this president could actually be causing some wrongdoing within our nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was really taken by or interested in how they're connecting politics to ethnicity, right, in there as well. And they're doing this kind of civic analysis, right? He won with the non-indigenous, but he didn't win the indigenous because they know his history. So it's like, the past is still part of what people are thinking about in terms of who they want to represent them, and that those thoughts are different depending on how people are positioned and what community they're part of.
I just think the positioning in terms of who they are in relationship to the indigenous people is really interesting. In spite of being indigenous, well, she got it, but did she really deserve it because she defended the indigenous people? It's just very interesting. It's like they're over there, in a way. But that it could be either a source of importance, it's really important in terms of our country's history, or it's sort of, they're there, but,
Yeah, like if you go back to one of the first, I think the most slides I've ever used in a presentation deck. This, oh my God. To a quote. El Básico. Right. Our committed genocide against the indigenous, our indigenous culture, our Mayan culture, right?
Whereas here, it's sort of like they're there. There's a distance.
The other interesting thing that, or another thing that I'm analyzing in this is people talking about the ancient Mayan, right? And a lot of times the more affluent kids would say we in relation to the ancient Maya, right, who built Tikal and who did all these amazing engineering feats and all that, but not in relation to current indigenous folks and their weaving and their cooking with firewood and that kind of stuff. So, and then also the way people talked about the Spaniards and who the Spaniards were tricking and how they did it, and who fought against the Spaniards and who didn't. A lot of positioning going on in there. So I think, hopefully you can see a little bit of the way that these conversations can elicit, or did, I think, elicit discussion that I wasn't really going to walk into in a classroom probably, and it would have been difficult for me to evoke as for lots of reasons, as a foreigner, as an outsider, as somebody from the United States, as a white person, and just as a person who's trying to talk about abstract topics, because that's a really difficult thing to get at in qualitative interviews. So we had a couple themes we wanted to. Whoa, sorry, it's got power theme. Got it? Right. So or we can alternate talking about these, I guess. So there was a way that we felt like having the images kind of created a third space, a more neutral space for conversation with the kids. And coming from really different places, rather than kind of the direct confrontation. I'm asking you a question. Here I am from the U.S. Asking you about your life as a Guatemalan. Kind of collectively, and maybe I'll take this opportunity to send these things around. Putting the focus on them and what they were doing and their interaction with each other. So, and we found that the kids were also like really taken with these cards. I mean, you take out the cards and they kind of dive on them and like really start looking and huddle together and pass them around and laugh at some of them and point at different things and share them with each other. It kind of like set up a different arena for conversation. So I'll pass around. I want to talk about the query.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think another thing about the power is that the United States and Guatemala has a very particular historical relationship, and white women coming and doing research in spaces where the consequences of asking and answering questions over time has been like quite dangerous for certain groups of people. And so I think by getting at abstract ways of thinking through the use of images, it doesn't get rid of issues of power and history that would make certain people feel uncomfortable or even unsafe about answering questions, but it definitely creates the third space where people can use kind of a problem-based approach, sort of like a Freirean approach to understanding the world around them. And so it doesn't get rid of like race or class or nationality or the United States interventions in Guatemala or the United States interventions in like Latin America as a whole. But what it does at a very particular historical moment is it perhaps makes it a little easier to have those conversations with the stakes a bit lower. And so I think it was useful in that regard, and it was fun.
Yeah, the kids seem to enjoy it. They like doing it. I don't know. I mean, those of you who do research with younger students, I've found like the younger it gets, the less the one-on-one interview kind of approach works. And we found, I mean, most of our kids were high school kids, but there were some middle school age kids, and the middle school age kids, the interviews were just, we might as well just throw them in the trash. But the focus groups were fine. They were able to talk about the images, and I think it would work with adults as well, but so kind of going at it slant with that group, because they're not used to sitting around talking about abstractions, and even if they did, it wouldn't necessarily be that useful. So, talked a lot. Any questions or comments or yes?
Yeah. So can you just talk for a little bit? I think I understand. The pictures are not as emotionally evocative as ones that I imagine you could have selected.
Oh yeah.
Right. So what was the rationale for doing it that way?
Well, I didn't want it to be like a, what do you call it, like a police, So, what do you think of this? Picture of, a dead body or something like that. I wanted to develop rapport with the young people. I wasn't trying to shock them. I think most people would be kind of predictably shocked by a shocking image. So, on the other hand, like the flag, I mean, that's like a very image. There's not much going on there, right? And it's hard to put your finger on what makes the difference between something that's so neutral as to be devoid of meaning or interpretation versus something that is neutral but you can interpret it. So I think that that's what I was going for, were images that were evocative but not sensationalistically so. I felt like in some ways some of the graffiti was verging on that, but it turned out not to be because they didn't really care about the graffiti in the way that I was like, oh my goodness, somebody's daring and writing something about Rios Montt on the wall. And they're looking and thinking like, oh, I hate it when people write on the wall. So, it was, it didn't work out the way that I thought. And I think, a too sensationalist an image, might not, like I think it was easy for them to look at an image of Rigoberta Menchú and have those different feelings about it, whereas it might not be so easy to look at a picture of a massacre site and have different feelings about it, because you really gotta, not be happy about a massacre site. If that makes sense. Yeah.
So was the goal of the study to look at an individual's civic identity or collective civic identity? Because, it seems like it's an identity-forming activity within itself.
Right. Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, and actually, I did have teachers who said, "Oh, can I keep the cards? Can I use them? In class?" Right. Not really individual civic identity. No. Looking at groups of people who are positioned in particular ways in the society, and what the how they are interacting with the policy reforms that are intended to transform them civically, right? And how they're taking them and appropriating them and turning them into their own sense of civic self, and kind of where that leaves the nation then, right? Because then, how are these people forming a nation? What are their big issues? If they all agree that the police can't be trusted, then there's some big issues there that maybe could be addressed across the groups. But then differing interpretations of past historical events, are something that educators have to think a lot about. So yeah.
Was there a causal interpretation for the genocide? Did any of the students have a causal for the interpretation of the historical?
History. I think like if you want to say causal, maybe not like A, B, and C, but like we are looking at kind of different interpretations of the Spanish conquest and how they've linked that differently as an actual cause of the genocide, like through sort of the ways that they talk about the genocide in reference to the history of inequality. So that's a causal, but it's not event-based. It's not like, oh, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. It's like the Spanish came, they created an unequal society, and then we thought about it.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense. Or,
yeah. I think like the El Colegio kids would say that, causal just in the sense of it's both these groups' fault. And the other groups might lay it completely at the feet of the elite and the army.
So like the idea of a banana republic in Guatemala is kind of like a real great symbol.
Yeah, none of the kids talked about, which is why I had that CAFTA image there that nobody took up. But none of the kids kind of put it in a global context, like, oh, and then this all started when you assassinated our democratically elected leader, right? They, didn't,
but the curriculum does. That's what's funny. The curriculum does. If you read the curriculum, it is trying to make everything that's in Guatemalan history contextualized in the whole world and explain it in those ways that create those webs of meaning, but their interpretation is not. It doesn't reach that.
They're not experiencing it contextually. Yeah. Right? They're experiencing. In terms of broader context, they're experiencing it locally.
All right. I think we're about out of time. So thanks.